In order to understand how interpretation at St. Marie constitutes a performance of the nation, it may be useful to think about how some aspects of interpretations have changed since the site first opened. The operation of St. Marie prior to the early 1990s revolved around a first-person model of interpretation. Specifically, Aboriginal men and women, as well as men of European ancestry, were given period costumes and were expected to interpret the historic site and interact with visitors in the guise of characters from St. Marie's history. These were supplemented by uniformed male and female interpreters who would interpret the site from a third-person, present-day perspective. So you had the people who were acting as though they were in the past and the people who were dressed in very nifty tour guide uniforms who were clearly from the present. Visitors to the site were treated to a variety of staged dramas and occasional soliloquies, as well as animation done by the people who were just going about their daily business. In addition, there would be one woman inside the museum, so not out on the historic site, who would have the costume of a 17th century woman, an Ursuline nun by the name of Charlotte Barré, who did extensive missionary work in Quebec and who was slated to come out to Huronia in 1650, but of course the site was abandoned by then. So that was the one opportunity for women, European women, to dress in costume. In the mid-1990s, the decision was made to allow women into costume, and they began to assume the role of the Danais, although the robes of the priests continue to be out of bounds to women until the present day. So only European men are allowed to wear the cassocks. The focus of interpretation at the site was changed at this time as well. So going from that first-person model of interpretation towards a third-person model of interpretation, where even though you're wearing the costume, you're still talking about the site in the present tense. First person became something that would only be done on special event days, usually once a week or so throughout the summer. The Charlotte Barré position in the museum was deemed to be unnecessary now that women were in costume, and they discontinued that as well. So whereas previously there was someone in the museum that you could actually talk to about the museum, now the museum is totally empty. Today, each of the interpreters at St. Marie performs a variety of different roles. In addition to giving tours, they do things like carpentry, blacksmithing, knitting, basket weaving, canoe making, all of which are called site animation. They also care for the curatorial aspects of the site, and they interact with the site's visitors. Though much of the performance is information-driven and verbally oriented, the interpreters are constantly involved in the performance of history. What is particularly interesting is how the audience becomes involved in keying or building the performance. Their assumption of performativity is what creates the site as a constant stage. Even the smallest detail, such as using a linen scrap to cover an engagement or wedding band, can lead to visitors assuming historical purpose. Everything about a person becomes part of his or her performance. Successful interpreters learn to gauge the audience's involvement in the performance and respond to it accordingly, using both mental and physical skills to convey information to the audience. In her book, Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, Barbara Kirschblatt-Gimblett borrows a quotation from Frederick Jameson that heritage is nostalgia for the present. This quotation holds particular truth for interpretation and performance at St. Marie. As Alan Gordon points out in his critique of St. Marie's authenticity, today's St. Marie among the Hurons portrays a partnership between the Wendat and the French missionaries and ignores, or at least downplays, the Jesuit efforts to undermine every aspect of Wendat culture. While this is in some ways an oversimplification of what is a very complex story, there is a negative truth contained in that. Not everybody, however, that I talked to necessarily saw that as a bad thing. An interpreter who had worked at other historic sites, as well as St. Marie, told me that it shows that from the beginning, Canada was about different groups meeting and sharing ideas. Everyone that I interviewed acknowledged that there is a certain amount of whitewashing that goes on, but most felt that this was necessary in order to understand the story of St. Marie from a variety of perspectives and to examine the events of the 17th century from a cultural rather than religious or political viewpoint. The words of one interpreter are particularly effective in expressing this. The way the site is set up, we have an emphasis on the positive side of, in fact, how amazing these people were. And it's true, they were very amazing. But for the history of Canada, you sort of see the cultural clash, and from the cultural clash, there are huge downsides. It's putting a positive spin on it, a little. A lot of people believe the Jesuits were bad people, and we try to counter that as much as possible. There are bad consequences, but they weren't bad people. However, this was not a view that was shared by everybody. Someone else said it very differently. We have a very happy Ste. Marie. We have a very happy story about noble intentions gone awry. Men and women operating in sometimes extraordinary ways in order to make those around them feel accommodated. Thematically, there's a constant tone of openness and compromise and understanding, and I think that this is largely spin because we live in a time that promotes cultural understanding and compromise. It wasn't the experience of compromise that drove these people here, it was zealousness. And the events, we can give some resonance and treat others as incidental. That isn't so much a criticism of the site as an observation, hopefully, that our Ste. Marie is as much a learning device as it is historical fact. In the interviews that I conducted, all of the interpreters were in agreement about one thing, that this revisioning of history was a condition necessitated by the live aspect of their job. Seeing history come to life, one interviewee claimed, makes it harder for people to ignore. It makes them understand, at least on some level, that these people were actually alive, that it wasn't a story or a movie, but life. In order for people to understand that history is real, in addition to being story, the history must be made accessible to them. This can manifest itself in a number of different ways, whether it's downplaying the imperial implications of the mission in Huronia, emphasizing the positive aspects of first contact, or completely dispensing with some of the more severe forms of the Jesuit devotion to their faith. By way of example, the most well-known man connected with the mission, Jean Brebeuf, wore a hair shirt under his cassock in order to bring himself closer to the pain and suffering of Christ on the cross. Not an uncommon act for a Jesuit in the 17th century, but certainly something that a modern audience might be uncomfortable or unfamiliar with. One interpreter summed this up by saying, "If asked about some of the site's more sensitive aspects, I do talk about them, but I don't like to bring them up on my own. We're told to be sensitive about some of the aspects of the site. If the visitor is presented with something that makes him or her uncomfortable, it will disrupt their ability to engage with history, and in consequence, disrupt the opportunity for them to participate in the experience as transactional." Though interpreters are costumes, their jobs do not conform easily to traditional notions of theater. The majority of interpretation at Ste. Marie is what Christopher Ford terms third-person interpretation. The crucial feature here is that all identification with the character remains in the third person, and because of this, the interaction between interpreter and visitor remains in the here and now. The event never becomes fictional. While Ford uses this to argue against performativity in third-person interpretation, we should not necessarily preclude it. Ford states that these interpreters never actually enter into any kind of role, nor do they ask visitors to accept them as such. This view is problematic in its linearity because it assumes that interpretation is a unidirectional phenomenon rather than a transactional procedure. As one interpreter said to me, "Once you put your costume on, you always kind of feel like you're in first person." What Ford neglects to consider is how the dynamic relationship between visitor and interpreter is established. Regardless of whether the visitor accepts the interpreter as a person of the 17th century, there are still other roles that the interpreter performs: interpreter, historian, customer service provider, artisan, to name a few. Thus, the interpretive performance is directed by the audience's expectation and response. For example, the interpreter who is assigned to the cookhouse at Ste. Marie may not ask the visitor to accept him as the cook, but he will be accepted by virtue of showcasing the craft of 17th century food preparation. He will be accepted as a cook, which in turn affects how the visitor and interpreter interact. A more pressing example of the effect of the visitor in determining this interaction would be Ste. Marie's Aboriginal staff members. The Aboriginal staff at Ste. Marie are currently all Ojibwe. Again, I'm not necessarily sure if that is true today, but in 2005, that was true. For many of the site's visitors, they are one of the main attractions. Many of the staff who participated in my research commented on how misconceptions of the native staff were one of the most common obstacles to interpretation that they encountered. Where do you keep the Indians is a very commonly asked question. And some of the interpreters reported that many visitors, both Canadian and otherwise, are quite happy to believe that the Aboriginal interpreters actually live at Ste. Marie in the wigwams and the longhouses. Though they understand that for the rest of the staff, Ste. Marie is a place of employment, the visitors will assume often that the native staff live there in what they see as a traditional Indian lifestyle. This idea of a traditional lifestyle has very little to do with the actuality of Aboriginal experience. It has developed out of 3 centuries of cultural misunderstanding and misrepresentation. The Indian that many people come to see is the one that Hollywood imagines for us, or else the noble savage of so many books for young boys. This kind of neo-Orientalism is very telling about the place that Canada's Aboriginal people have in any conception of the nation. Characterization is also a really important part of interpretation at Ste. Marie. Even when not playing a specific character or person, most of the interpreters are aware of the stories of the men who were at Ste. Marie, and also tend to assume some of the characteristics of the people who worked wherever they happened to be positioned for that day. In the 10 years of the mission, the personnel changes were quite frequent, as men would come and go from Quebec. Some would stay for only a few months, but others would also serve there for decades. All of the interpreters are aware of the general backgrounds of the men who were there. The Dunnies were generally poor but very religious men doing physical labor in exchange for room, board, clothing, and spiritual salvation. A few of them, like the master carpenter and the blacksmith, had trades that were able to be put to use for the mission. They were responsible for all of the physical labor. The Jesuits, as I mentioned, went through quite a long process to become priests. Most came from very wealthy backgrounds, were fluent in several languages, and had been educated quite extensively. They were unused to physical labor to begin with, and when they would put on the black cassocks, they would find it very difficult to actually do anything, since they're fairly restrictive. The Huron people were largely divided into 2 factions, those who were sympathetic to the French, who were interested in converting to Christianity, and those who remained traditional. Only those who had actually converted or who were interested in converting would likely have come to Ste. Marie. So even when people are not playing specific characters, the interpreters still have to respect how these factors would dictate some aspects of their performance. A priest would not be chopping wood or preparing clothing. Someone dressed as a Huron would not be blacksmithing. All of this peripheral information informs any type of interpretation or activity done on the site.